This is the moment Benjamin Netanyahu's war strategy collapsed into catastrophic personal vulnerability. This is the visual that is terrifying the Israeli cabinet this morning. This is the notification that the prime minister has been dreading more than any military threat in his entire political career. If you look at the secure communications hub beneath the Kira military headquarters in Tel Aviv, you will see something unprecedented. Empty chairs, silent phones, and a prime minister who, for the first time in 14 months of relentless conflict, cannot control the narrative. The screens that usually display real-time battlefield intelligence now show something far more devastating. Iranian state media broadcasting footage of precision missile strikes hitting a compound in northern Tel Aviv, the exact compound where sources confirm Netanyahu was meeting with his inner security cabinet just 90 minutes before the attack. As of 40:47 a.m. Eastern Time, Saturday, March 14, 2026, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps publicly claimed they successfully targeted and struck the operational headquarters of Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israeli government, already fracturing under pressure from Washington, reeling from collapsing approval ratings at home and watching its military objectives disintegrate across three separate fronts, has just been blindsided by something far worse than another missile strike. They have been blindsided by a perfectly timed information weapon that strips away the one thing Netanyahu built his entire political survival on: control. In this deep dive, we are going to reveal exactly what happened in those 90 minutes before the strike. We are going to expose the leaked conversations from inside the cabinet meeting that show how fractured Netanyahu's inner circle has become. We are going to show you the financial markets already pricing in leadership collapse, and we are going to explain why this is not just another escalation in a regional conflict. This is the beginning of the end for a leader who gambled everything on a military solution and is now watching that gamble destroy him personally. Netanyahu is not just facing military pressure. He is being systematically isolated, abandoned by allies, and psychologically broken by a crisis he cannot spin his way out of. 18 months ago, Benjamin Netanyahu stood before the Knesset and made a promise that would define his entire political legacy. He promised the Israeli people total security. He promised them that the military operation he was about to launch would restore deterrence that had been eroding for years. He promised them swift, decisive victory that would reshape the entire security landscape of the Middle East. The plan was to demonstrate overwhelming force, eliminate threats on multiple fronts simultaneously, and force every adversary in the region to understand that Israel under his leadership was untouchable. It was supposed to take 6 months maximum. He promised that within half a year, Hamas would be destroyed as a military force, Hezbollah would be neutralized along the northern border, and Iran would be forced to the negotiating table by the sheer weight of Israeli military dominance backed by unlimited American support. He stood in front of the cameras and told the families of hostages that their loved ones would be home by Passover. He promised the reservists being called up that their sacrifice would be measured in months, not years. He promised the international community that Israel would demonstrate restraint proportional to the threat. But the cost was not just military operations and international criticism. The cost was something far deeper and far more destructive. This meant sacrificing relationships with European allies who had stood with Israel for decades. This meant burning bridges with the Biden administration that had privately warned him against the scale of the offensive. This meant destroying the careful diplomatic architecture that had taken generations to build across the Arab world. This meant turning the United Nations Security Council into a hostile environment where even traditional supporters began abstaining on resolutions protecting Israel. Opposition voices inside Israel tried to warn him. Former military commanders, intelligence chiefs who had served under 4 different prime ministers, and even members of his own Leak party started raising concerns within the first 3 months. They argued that the operation was expanding beyond its original objectives. They warned that the international backlash was becoming unsustainable. They pointed to the economic costs that were starting to crack the foundation of Israel's high-tech economy. They pleaded with him to accept a ceasefire framework that the Americans were quietly pushing through back channels. But Netanyahu dismissed them all. He called them defists. He accused them of not understanding the existential nature of the threat. He told them they were stuck in the old paradigm of limited operations and managed conflicts when what Israel needed was total transformation of the security equation. He said history would prove him right. He said the critics would be forgotten footnotes when future generations looked back at the leader who finally solved Israel's security crisis permanently. Netanyahu gambled that the international community would lose interest after the initial media cycle faded. He assumed that American political pressure would ease once the presidential primaries were over and Washington became distracted by domestic concerns. He assumed that Arab states, privately relieved to see Iranian proxies weakened, would quietly support the operation even while publicly condemning it. He assumed that the Israeli public would tolerate any cost as long as he delivered absolute security in return. He assumed wrong. At 3:15 a.m. local time in Tel Aviv, Iranian missiles began launching from 3 separate locations. For 47 seconds, Israeli air defense systems tracked the incoming trajectories. Then, the most sophisticated missile defense architecture on the planet did exactly what it was designed to do. It intercepted 83% of the incoming threats. But missile defense is a mathematics problem, not a miracle. When you launch enough projectiles at precisely calculated intervals, some percentage will always penetrate. And the Revolutionary Guard had spent 18 months studying exactly which percentages mattered. Witnesses near the Arkin Park area described seeing 3 distinct flashes in the pre-dawn darkness. The sound came 17 seconds later, rolling across the city like thunder that refused to stop. Emergency services dispatch logs obtained by sources inside the Israeli Fire and Rescue Authority show that the first call came in at 3:17 a.m. The caller reported a massive explosion in the government district north of the Old Port area. The second call, 14 seconds later, reported structural damage to a building that the caller could not identify by name, but described as having heavy security barriers and no visible signage. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps public statement went live on their official channels at 3:19 a.m. Tel Aviv time, exactly 4 minutes after the launches. The statement did not use cautious language. It did not hedge. It declared that precision strikes had successfully hit the operational command center being used by Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet. The statement specifically noted that intelligence indicated HIV value targets were present at the location at the time of impact, but this was just the beginning. While emergency responders were still trying to reach the strike zone, while Israeli military sensors were implementing immediate media blackout protocols, while the Prime Minister's security detail was executing evacuation procedures that had been planned for exactly this scenario, 3 other crises were erupting simultaneously across multiple dimensions of Israeli governance and security. While the missiles were still in flight, financial markets in Asia that had just opened for Saturday trading began reacting to early reports. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange does not trade on Saturdays, but the international derivatives markets that price Israeli sovereign debt never sleep. Within 8 minutes of the Iranian announcement, credit default swaps on Israeli government bonds spiked 27%. On the screens of traders from Singapore to Dubai, the algorithms were processing a simple calculation. Political instability plus military vulnerability plus international isolation equals default risk. At that exact same moment, the secure hotline between the Pentagon and Israeli Defense Forces headquarters went silent, not because of technical failure, because the American side stopped answering. Sources within the U.S. Defense Department who spoke on condition of complete anonymity revealed that Secretary of Defense had given explicit instructions to all liaison officers, no contact with Israeli counterparts until the White House National Security Council completed an emergency assessment of whether Netanyahu was still in operational command. The Americans were not going to commit to any coordinated response until they knew who was actually making decisions in Tel Aviv. And most shockingly, the leak that would prove most devastating to Netanyahu came from inside his own government. At 3:01 a.m., exactly 16 minutes after the strikes, a cabinet minister whose name is being protected by every news organization in Israel sent a text message to a group of 23 Knesset members. The message contained 4 words that have now been confirmed by 3 separate sources who received it. The 4 words were simply this: he was in there. Pause. The global oil markets do not wait for official confirmations. They price risk in real time based on the information available in the moment.
Brent crude futures opened Sunday evening in Asian markets at $138 per barrel, a spike of 11% in less than 6 hours. The traders do not care about political theater or government statements. They care about one question: if the leader of a nuclear-armed state at the center of the world's most strategically critical region might have just been targeted in his own capital, what does that do to supply chains that depend on stability in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf?
According to leaks from sources inside the emergency meeting of Israel's security cabinet that convened at 4:10 a.m. in an undisclosed bunker location, the scene was unlike anything in Israeli political history. The participants included the defense minister, the foreign minister, the finance minister, 3 senior military commanders, the head of Mossad, and the director of Shin Bet Internal Security. The topic was not military response options. The topic was the question that no one wanted to ask out loud, but that everyone in the room was thinking: where exactly is the prime minister right now, and who is actually in command? We have learned from 2 separate sources who were present in that bunker that the defense minister opened the meeting with a question directed at the military secretary to the cabinet. The question was direct and shocking in its implications. He asked, "Do we have visual confirmation of the prime minister's location within the last 30 minutes?" The military secretary's response, according to both sources, was a silence that lasted nearly 15 seconds before he said visual confirmation is being established through secure protocols. That answer told everyone in the room exactly what they needed to know. In a normal security crisis, the prime minister would have been on video conference with this exact group within 8 minutes of an attack. The fact that visual confirmation was still being established 45 minutes after the strike meant one of three possibilities. Either Netanyahu was injured and they were managing the optics of how to reveal that, or he was in a location so secure that even establishing video communication required complex technical setup, or there was a breakdown in command structures so severe that basic protocols were not functioning. It was a cold, calculated political decision that happened in that bunker. They looked at the international pressure that had been building for months, the Rwanda pressure that was destroying Israel's relationships with allies and costing the economy billions and lost investment in tourism. They looked at the military objectives that had not been achieved despite 14 months of intensive operations and the loss of hundreds of soldiers. They looked at the polls showing Netanyahu's approval rating had
collapsed to 28%, the lowest of any sitting Israeli prime minister in the history of polling. They realized that the missile strike had created a moment of uncertainty that could be used to force a transition they had been afraid to initiate politically. The decision was made in that room. According to our sources, if Netanyahu could not or would not appear publicly and demonstrate command authority within 6 hours, they would invoke emergency protocols. They would not call it a removal. They would not use the word incapacitated. They would simply state that during a period of active military crisis, executive authority was being temporarily shared with the defense minister to ensure continuity of command. As the meeting was concluding, one of the senior military commanders made a comment that both sources said sent a chill through the room. The audio feed was still active when he said to the person next to him, 18 months of this, and now we are here. We told him this would happen. The other person responded with just 2 words. He knew the feed was cut immediately, but those 4 words between 2 of Israel's most senior security officials revealed everything about how isolated Netanyahu had become from his own military establishment. Why did Iran do this? Follow the strategic calculation. The Revolutionary Guard is not a terrorist organization acting on impulse. It is a sophisticated military and intelligence apparatus that reports directly to the supreme leader and operates on long-term strategic planning. They wanted to demonstrate that Israel's most advanced air defenses, supplied and supported by American technology and intelligence, could not protect Israel's political leadership in the heart of Tel Aviv. But they wanted even more than that. Sources say Iranian leadership and the IRGC had a very specific strategic meeting 6 weeks before this attack. The message was clear: force Israel into a position where continuing the current military strategy becomes politically impossible. The missile strike was not designed to kill Netanyahu. It was designed to create exactly the crisis of confidence and command chaos that is now unfolding. This shifts power from the prime minister's office to the security establishment and potentially to political rivals who have been waiting for exactly this kind of vulnerability. Netanyahu can no longer claim that his aggressive military posture is providing security when Iranian missiles can target him personally in the government district of Israel's largest city. He can no longer maintain the narrative that overwhelming force creates deterrence when the adversary just demonstrated they can penetrate defenses and strike at the symbolic heart of Israeli power. He is just a leader who bet everything on a military solution and is now discovering that military solutions create their own cascade of vulnerabilities. By launching the strike and then immediately publicizing it with specific claims about targeting Netanyahu's location, Iran transformed the narrative from Israel is degrading Iranian proxies to Iran can reach the Israeli prime minister whenever they choose. When a regional power projects that level of capability and brazen confidence, that signals to every other player in the Middle East that the balance of power is shifting. The Saudis are watching, the Emiratis are watching, the Egyptians are watching, and they are all recalculating what relationship with Israel is worth if Israel cannot guarantee even its own leadership security. What historians will call the Tel Aviv vulnerability moment is the perfect storm of military overreach, meeting political isolation, meeting strategic miscalculation. This is not just another escalation in a long-running conflict. This is the moment when the fundamental assumptions underlying Netanyahu's entire security doctrine collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. His theory was that overwhelming military force would restore deterrence and force adversaries to accept Israeli dominance. The reality playing out is that overwhelming force created determination in adversaries to find asymmetric responses that turn strength into weakness. The legal ramifications are unprecedented in Israeli political history. The Attorney General's office has been quietly preparing an analysis of constitutional authority during leadership and capacitation scenarios. Multiple sources within the Justice Ministry confirm that the legal team has been examining Section 16 of Basic Law, the government, which deals with temporary inability of the Prime Minister to fulfill duties. The claims being reviewed include potential violations of command authority protocols, failure to implement approved security measures, and decisions made regarding military operations that exceeded the scope of cabinet authorization. This is not opposition politicians looking for political advantage. This is the permanent legal establishment of the Israeli government preparing for scenarios that were previously theoretical. If it becomes clear that Netanyahu was in a location that violated his own security details protocols at the time of the strike, that could trigger criminal negligence investigations. If decisions about military operations were made without proper cabinet consultation during this crisis period, that could violate the legal framework that governs executive authority in Israel. Here is the domino effect that is now in motion. If Netanyahu cannot demonstrate full command authority and appears weakened or compromised, then the coalition partners who have been quietly unhappy with the war strategy have political cover to demand changes. If coalition partners demand changes and Netanyahu refuses, the government could collapse into new elections. If elections are called during an active military crisis, the campaign becomes a referendum on Netanyahu's entire approach to security. If that referendum goes against him, then 18 months of military operations and all the international costs that came with them get reframed as a catastrophic strategic failure. We are looking at the potential collapse of not just a government, but an entire security paradigm that has defined Israeli policy for nearly 2 years. The Americans are watching this with a mixture of concern and quiet calculation. President Biden and his national security team have been trying to find an exit strategy from supporting military operations they believe have become counterproductive to regional stability and American interests. But they needed an Israeli counterpart who was politically strong enough to accept a ceasefire framework without looking weak. A weakened Netanyahu cannot deliver a ceasefire without his right-wing coalition partners abandoning him. But a strong Netanyahu has refused every ceasefire proposal because he believes military victory is still achievable. The Gulf states that quietly normalized relations with Israel over the past decade are now reassessing the value proposition. They partnered with Israel because they saw a stable, technologically advanced, militarily dominant regional power that could help counter Iranian influence. What they are seeing now is a country whose prime minister might have just been targeted by Iranian missiles in his own capital, whose military has been unable to achieve stated objectives after 14 months of intensive operations, and whose international standing has deteriorated to the point where traditional allies are distancing themselves publicly. A desperate Netanyahu facing political collapse and potential legal accountability can be manipulated by adversaries who understand his psychological profile. Intelligence assessments from 3 different allied nations obtained by sources familiar with the analysis all reach the same conclusion. Leaders under extreme political and legal pressure make decisions based on short-term survival rather than long-term strategic interest. Those decisions often escalate conflicts in ways that create even deeper crises. This creates a split in the Israeli coalition that cannot be healed through normal political negotiation. On one side, you have the hard-right nationalist parties who form the core of Netanyahu's parliamentary majority. Their stance is ideological commitment to the military campaign regardless of costs. Their motivation is religious and nationalist belief that this is an existential struggle that must be won completely. On the other side, you have centrist coalition partners, security establishment figures, and even moderate members of Likud who are looking at the strategic situation and seeing unsustainable costs with diminishing returns. A divided Israel cannot accomplish what Netanyahu promised. It cannot simultaneously conduct intensive military operations, maintain international legitimacy, preserve economic stability, and sustain public morale. Each of those pillars depends on the others, and when one cracks, the stress transfers to all the rest. Reports from sources close to Netanyahu's inner circle describe a prime minister who has changed dramatically over the past 6 months,